Well, good morning. It is great to be back here. You know, the words or the question, what else could happen, is not a question that anyone is probably really interested in asking in this political season, because as soon as you say what else could happen, well, then something else happens. We don't want to dare ask it because, 12 months ago, who would have thought that we'd be in the political circus that we're in? And it's a political circus that is less like fun for the whole family and more like something that I just saw in your school paper. I see you have your own personal experience with the creepy clown craze that seems to be happening all over the country. Something that professional clowns aren't particularly excited about, actually, but these imposter clowns, right? But I think that kind of craziness is the moment that we're in. It's certainly a time of confusion. It's a time of vexation. And for many people, it's a time of despair, a time where they're thinking, can I just put my head in the sand for a while, and then when I pull it out of the sand, everything will just be all right. I understand that temptation. I understand the temptation to just be sort of paralyzed by the vexation. I understand the temptation to hear the voices that are saying we've had too much of an addiction to politics. Look at your arm and see where the IV is going in, and it's feeding you this desire for power. I understand those concerns. And though I understand those concerns, I think the last thing to do is to stick your head in the sand. The last thing to do is to say, I need to avoid the realities of politics. Now, I know that some people disagree with that, but hear me out. Hear me out. Believe it or not, if you are a Christian in the United States right now, you have a great opportunity in this moment, this very moment of vexation and craziness. The reason that you have that is because you are a disciple of Jesus Christ in the context of the United States of America. And you have to understand is that if you're a disciple in the United States of America, that's different than being a disciple in, say, North Korea or Saudi Arabia. Because if you're a Christian in the United States, you're a citizen who actually has actual possibilities, actual opportunities for participation. If you're in North Korea or if you're in Saudi Arabia, you don't have that. You are in a totalitarian state. We're not in a totalitarian state. You actually can participate. Obviously, all the way to the level of running for office, but even as minimal as doing something like just writing a letter to your congressman or to your mayor. So there's all kinds of levels of participation and opportunity that we have. But still, what do we do with that participation? How should a disciple of Jesus live for Christ in the United States in this moment? So a few things I think can help us with our perspective in this moment. And these things I hope will help us to think about how to live Christianly as a citizen here and now, and how we can step back for a moment, but instead of staying back, we step back in to public commitments. Number one, we have to remember our first loyalty. Our first loyalty. Now, when Jesus gives his disciples the Great Commission in Matthew 28, now last time I was here, I talked about the end of the Great Commission. At the beginning of it, he approaches them and he says to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. All of it. And if you're a disciple, you are a follower of the one who has all of this authority. When he said that, he didn't say, down the road I'm going to have all authority. He said, no, I've got it. I've got it now. I mean, that's the reason why the beginning of the book of Acts, they get excited about having a resurrected Jesus with them for about 40 days. That's why they ask him, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel at this time? Why? Because they know he's got all authority, and they want him actually in that moment to make that authority present, especially taking over Rome. And he says, sorry, can't tell you when that's going to happen, but it will happen down the road. But for now, go be my disciples. Go be my spirit-empowered people. But he still is the one, though he hasn't established in fulfillment now his authority here, he is the one who has it. And we're the ones who proclaim that, who believe that. If we believe that, our ultimate allegiance cannot be to anyone other than to him or to anything other than him. So what does that mean? That means you can't worship your country. You can love your country, you can be a patriot, but you need to resist the temptation of idolatry when it comes to your country. Love the United States. Wave flags. Don't worship those flags. Worship Jesus. Follow Jesus. And say that whatever I'm doing, he is number one. And because he's number one, that means if there's a tension between my country and him, I'm going with him. I'm going with him no matter what. The fact that he has all authority, the fact that God is going to set everything right in the end, also reminds us of another dimension of perspective. And please understand what I mean when I say this, but it's true. God does not need our country. He does not need it. The United States do not have to be part of his purposes. He may choose to use the United States for part of his purposes, but he doesn't need us to bring about his purposes. Now, just a quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of something called American exceptionalism? Oh, it's about 30. Okay, so for the rest of you, American exceptionalism just simply means that there's something about the United States, because of the character of the people and the opportunities that it provides, where it is a unique and distinctive country. I believe that. But to believe that America is exceptional is not to confuse the United States of America with God's new chosen people. There's only one chosen people, and that's Israel, okay? We're not that. I mean, just think about this, okay? There's some people like, but we're God's country. Listen, think about it this way. When you learned about the history of the United States, where did you read about a divine visitation to the Continental Congress or to George Washington? Where did you read that God came and said to somebody, you now are my country? You don't. So the point is that we're exceptional, but we're not Israel. And what that means is we can appreciate where we are, but we have to resist making too much of it. And because we're citizens of the opportunity we have, we can resist making too little of it. Some people, they'll hear me say we're not Israel. They go, that's right. So that means, hate on the United States and then just give into your apathy about the political process. That's not the point. The point is just seeing where we are rightly and recognize that, yes, can God use this country? Sure he can, but we can't confuse our country with some kind of unique country that God raised up to be the final country that brings about his purposes in the world. You don't see that anywhere in the Bible. So, God doesn't need us, but he can use us. Then there's this part to think about. Part of the language of despair that there is in this moment. Part of that despair seems to suggest a very confusing to me kind of thing. It actually suggests that people are so scared about this moment that they're not really sure that God can handle it. So like, I don't know. I mean, because if he gets in or she gets in, I mean, I guess God's going to have to just say, oh, well, so much for my plans. Because they got in office. Because I guess they've got more authority than the authority that Jesus said he had. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But there are people who are saying, oh no, this is the most important election ever, and if things don't go a certain way, our country's going to hell in a handbasket. To which I say the following. If our country is still here, after having Christians participate in human trafficking and supporting Jim Crow, why in the world do you think that this is the worst moment? Don't you think that by now we should have been taken out if that's the case? But here we are. Here we are. Please, if you want to get people to write checks to you, if you want them to pay you money, if you have an organization that thrives on scaring people, then please say, this election is the election on which everything hinges for world history, and please support us because we want to get the right person in office. And scare people enough, and they'll start writing checks. Because they will. And people do it all the time. It's one of the ways to raise money, is get people scared. But if you're going to really be someone who believes that all authority in heaven and earth belongs to Jesus, then you would never say, well, because of this election, I'm not so sure that God can handle it. I'm not so sure that no matter what happens, that God can't manage the situation. Let's look at world history. God's managed a lot. So is this an important moment? Of course it's an important moment. Every election is an important moment. But this is not an apocalyptic moment. So let's step back from the despair. Let's step back from thinking God can handle it. What is your eschatology anyway? How do you think the story ends? The story ends by every knee bowing, every tongue confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord. The story ends by God saying, I'm going to set everything right. I'm going to bring final justice. I'm going to bring shalom. Everything's going to be the way that it's supposed to be. I'm going to do it. And I've given you a hint of that because Jesus has been raised from the dead. If you believe that, despair cannot be what eclipses hope. You have to be hopeful no matter what the circumstances look like. How countercultural would that be in this moment? Where with all the despair that people have, you say, yes, it is like a political version of the crazy clown craze. But my hope is in God, not in clowns. So those are some things that I think are important for our perspective. Now there's some other things I think that are important for the ways that we sort of put our faith into practice in this moment. So one of the ways is, you've heard me say this many times speaking here, we have to think about how to live out the second greatest commandment. Jesus asked, what are the greatest commandments? The first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is a positive way of saying, have no other gods before me. Yet another reason why you can't worship the country. But number two, he says, the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Just as you want what's best for you, you want that for your neighbor. And there's no asterisk beside neighbor. Your neighbor is every human being. That's one of the reasons why, in Luke, the question about who the neighbor is, right, comes with the parable of the Good Samaritan. The last person a Jew thought was going to be a neighbor. But who's the neighbor? Samaritan is your neighbor. Every human being, every image bearer is your neighbor. Them being your neighbor does not depend upon whether you have political agreement with them. So here's one other thing that you can do if you really love your neighbor. Number one, pray for everyone that's involved in the political process, whether they're on your side or not. There's no qualifications when Paul tells Timothy, I ask you to pray for leaders, for rulers. He didn't say, now, here are the rulers, Timothy, to pray for. This is the list of the chosen ones. The rest of them, now you pray against them. Right? That's not what he says. That's not what he says. And isn't it interesting that a lot of times when we're warning people about something, we're so busy warning them about what those people are doing that what never gets said is pray for them. Pray for them because they're image bearers. Pray that God would do his work in them. Pray that God would transform them. But instead, usually it's pray that we win. I'm not saying don't pray to win, okay? But don't only pray to win. When you think about praying about this election, who do you pray for? Do you only pray for certain people, certain groups of people, or do you pray for all human beings? Do you really want the best for all human beings? Or do you only want the best for your people, whoever your people are? If you are a Christian who takes loving your neighbor as yourself seriously, praying for everyone ought to be characteristic of who we are, characteristic of what we do. A second way that you can love your neighbor as yourself is live out a commitment to tell the truth, perhaps especially about the people that aren't on your side. Now, somebody might say, oh, I tell the truth about them all the time. That's the thing. I mean, because they're wrong. Have you ever thought about those situations where there might be 95% of something, and you go, oh, I'm sure they're wrong, and there's 5%, you go, you know, they might have a point there. Have you ever thought about publicly agreeing about the 5% that you agree with? Have you ever thought about telling the truth about that? Or are you thinking about winning a political advantage so you wouldn't dare tell the truth about the people you disagree with? Do you want people to tell the truth about you? Do you want people to say, hey, you've got some good ideas. Hey, those Christians, they really are people that do great things. You know a person who tells the truth about Christians that is an unexpected ally? Nicholas Kristof, who writes for the New York Times. It's a very interesting thing because Nicholas Kristof, I remember when I first started reading him, I thought, this dude gets on my nerves. But do you know what he did once and more than once? He writes about the people, because he goes all around the world, especially like developing country type things. He says, you know who I see doing the work in developing countries? Evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics. They're the ones who don't only talk about caring for the poor and looking into development, they're actually doing it. They're actually risking their lives, giving their lives to doing it. And he also says, there's a lot of things about them I don't agree with. A lot of things they say I don't agree with, but they're there. Now, it's interesting to me that he's kind of known for that. Are we known for that? There's an interesting thing that we read in 2 Peter. There's an interesting line. Verse 16 of chapter 2. He says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants for God. And what I wonder is if sometimes what we've done in our political approach in the evangelical world is we've kind of used our freedom to cover up the evil of things that we don't do so well. And in part, we try to take advantage of our freedom to advantage ourselves, and we kind of ignore other people. We ignore those who aren't like us. We don't necessarily tell the truth about those who are not like us. If we're going to live out the second greatest commandment, we need to be committed to actually telling the truth about people. I'm not saying it's easy. It's hard. But we need to be committed to telling the truth about them. The third thing, in terms of living out the second greatest commandment, we have to, in terms of our perspective on politics, we have to commit to a long view rather than a kind of music video view, like 3 minutes. And the reason I say that is, if you actually look at evangelical participation in politics, last time I was here, I noted that it's not really to the late 90s that you get anything like a consensus among evangelical Christians that they ought to be involved in the political process. Now, let's say that that's 1998. It's now 2016. It hasn't even been 2 decades of something like a consensus of evangelicals being involved in politics. And my question to you is, if you've only really been in the game for less than 2 decades, what should be your expectation about what gets accomplished? Particularly when other people never got out of the game for decades, for like a century. I mean, do you think because you got back in the game for a decade and a half, that all of a sudden everyone's just going to let you do what you want? They're not going to do that. And then there's just the way that the political process works itself. Most of what happens in politics is, one, not a matter of crisis management. Most of what happens in politics are things that people don't talk about in the news all the time. But there are all these little things that people do, managing our life every day, looking at problems that we have in our world, trying to discover what kind of policies we need to put into place. And then when people think about having those policies, very often, especially at the national level, it's a very long, plodding, incredibly unsexy process of going from idea to policy. Policies don't happen like that. Right? In fact, policies happen. It's like if you're looking at like something under a microscope that moves real slowly. It's like think about how slowly it looks when it's under the microscope and how small it is. You can hardly notice it's moving. And if you're not even looking at the microscope, you might not even see it as moving. That's the way the political process works a lot of the time. And if you're going to be involved in that kind of political process, then you have to be in it for the long haul. I saw recently an interview. There's a historian named Daryl Hart, and what he said was, one of the things that was characteristic of a lot of evangelicals getting involved in politics is that they really were less concerned about the doing of politics than politics being a means to sort of put into place or to protect or establish certain moral concerns that they had. And the point is that their interest is in the moral concerns and not actually about how you accomplish it politically and even how you do politics. It's like other people do politics, we sound the alarm about issues. Well, if we want things to happen, at least some people have to be involved in that slow, prodding political process. Otherwise, you hand it over to other people. If we hand it over to other people, then you're saying, I trust you. And some people, they are worthy of your trust. But there are other people, if you're really concerned about them, are we grooming people, forming people to be involved in that nitty-gritty, long, plodding, not so publicly interesting process? That's the reality of the way the political world works. And this is a moment where we can say, oh, maybe we haven't really thought about how politics actually works. And maybe now we can remind ourselves of that. And maybe we can encourage and inform some people to be involved and to do that. Here's a last thing about loving our neighbors as ourselves. We could consider alliances with other people and consider what they might have to teach us. It's interesting that if you look at the way that evangelicals, particularly mostly white evangelicals, have thought about politics, either the last decade and a half or even the ones that were involved, let's say, since the mid-'70s, they haven't sought strategically how to learn from African American Christians. They haven't thought, because of their moral concerns, go, you know what? There are people who don't believe the same things that we believe, but their morality overlaps with ours, and it seems like they might have the same public concerns that we do. Maybe we should think about having a coalition with those people. That's not what's happened. Now, I happen to know some people that are trying to do that right now. But what if it became typical that we're looking for how we can actually work with people who aren't just typically the ones we've worked with the last decade and a half, or for some, the last 3 or 4 decades? We have a great opportunity for new alliances right now. And the thing is, when we do that, when we have those alliances, we're thinking not just about us, we're thinking about all of our neighbors. Well, before I close, I guess there's the whole question, what about the election itself? You know, the sands in the hourglass are running out on the circus, friends, right? And you're thinking, please, let those sands go faster. I understand. I agree. So, number one, if you're registered to vote, vote. That's the first thing. Actually vote. There's so many people I keep saying, well, because of these choices at the top of the ticket, you know, I'm going to sit this one out. To which I say, have you actually looked at the entire ballot? Because did you know that there's a whole lot on the ballot besides who's running for president? And are you aware of the fact that most of those other things that are on the ballot, that most of those things will probably have a more direct impact on your life than who runs for president? Are you thinking about, that phrase, all politics is local? There are people who manage these things, right? There are people who are involved in local politics. There are people at the town level, at the state level, not just at the national level. Somebody votes those people in. There are some of those people, some of those races are going on in this election. At least vote for them. If you need to write in somebody at the top of the ticket, write them in. But look at the other part of the ballot. And think about it this way. It's really not just about yourself. When you vote, part of what you're doing is this is one of your greatest opportunities to love your neighbor. How can I, by how I vote, think about the good of my neighbors? Not just about my preferences, but the good of my neighbors. This is one of the ways you can serve your neighbors. I mean, in case you're not aware, it's not like we're overrun with people going to the polls when election rolls around. We don't have anything like the kind of voter participation that they had when they had the referendum about whether Scotland was going to be independent from the UK. Right? You had like 95% showed up. Right? And in this election, people are like, oh, I'm just staying away. Staying away just because of who's running for president? Is that the only thing? I think this is one of these moments where we have to remember the United States exists because we're getting away from a monarchy, right? You would think with the way the presidential elections operate and the rhetoric around it and all the attention people give to it, that every 4 years we elect a new monarch. But then once the monarch gets in, what does everybody do? Everybody complains because the monarch can't get everything done that the monarch promised that they would do. Why? Oh, right. Because in our country we have separation of powers. So the point is, you're not voting for a monarch. And you have an incredible opportunity to love your neighbor by voting. And if you're tired of Hillary and Donald, turn your attention to learning about all those other names on the ballot. Because they're actual people. And they're going to do jobs. And those jobs are going to affect your life. So please, vote. And just two other things. One, if you don't vote, consider this. If you don't vote, in a country like this where you have an opportunity as a citizen to participate, then please make it your opportunity or your commitment to be the person that says, I'm not going to complain then. Why? Because I checked out and let somebody else be involved. I mean, it's easy to complain, but it's an interesting thing to complain when you have the rights of a citizen and the opportunity as citizens to actually be involved in the society. So please, don't complain if you check out, because you're basically saying, you do it. That's what you're doing, right? If you check out. But you have the opportunity to participate as citizens. What a discipleship opportunity. Consider who we are. Consider the practices that we can perform. Consider the radical witness, the encouraging witness, the hopeful witness that can be in a country that is losing its mind and tempted to great despair. Let me pray for us. Lord, thank you that we have the privilege of being citizens in a place like this that is not your chosen country, but it is a place where disciples live and where disciples have citizenship opportunity. Help us to truly live as your disciples, remembering who we are, remembering the privilege and opportunity to live as transformed people who love our neighbors in many ways. Help us to do that. Catalyze our imaginations so that we can think of better and better ways to model, to demonstrate what it is to be people of hope rather than people of despair. We pray this in the name of Christ. Amen.